Hi, this is Ben Llewellyn. Today I'm talking about the Basque Icelandic Pidgin language. What is it? If you haven't hit that subscribe button, do that now and I'll tell you. First of all, what is a pidgin language? A pidgin is what happens when two groups of people who don't have a common language come together and have to put together pieces of both or several languages in order to communicate with each other. This happens a lot in Papua New Guinea, and you take, for instance, in Africa, the Swahili language may have emerged originally as a pidgin between Bantu languages and peoples coming down from the Arabic countries and Malaysia in terms of traders, so that people had to find a way to communicate with each other when they had no common language. So they created a language out of bits of their own languages with a very simple grammar. And in this case, the Basque Icelandic Pidgin language, it is very similar in that the grammar is very simple. The vocabulary is limited, and what we have are very simple sentences that people needed in terms of trade or bartering in many cases. One thing to note is that a pidgin is not a native language. It's a Creole mashed together just for the purposes of communication. And one of the reasons why I wanted to show you this is because there's a difference between a language just used for communication and the language which becomes the medium of a culture, the basket of an identity. A pidgin is just linking people together in the most basic sense so that they can accomplish a task or survive in commerce usually. Basque Icelandic Pidgin does not have any of the Icelandic language in it. I should note that first and foremost. What it is a mushing together of Basque, French, Spanish, Dutch, English, perhaps some German and Latin, that these whalers, they sailed across the seas hunting whales, had gathered from being on different ships usually and interacting with crews who spoke a plethora of different languages, but the people who created this pidgin were definitely Basque and from the Basque country. What we have is limited in terms of the manuscripts that it was recorded in, which come from Iceland, hence Icelandic Pidgin. And this pidgin arose out of people from the Basque country hunting whales in the fjords of Western Iceland and needing a way to communicate with the local population. So how did we get to a position where Basque speakers were interacting with Icelandic speakers with no common language? First of all, let's look at those two languages. First, Basque. This is a non-Indo-European language. It's not related to any Romance language like French, or Celtic like Welsh, or Germanic like Dutch. It's its own language group, and it forms words a lot of the times by adding things on, a very agglutinative nature. And the structure of the sentences are completely different from anything that you would find in the languages that you know, like French, Welsh, German. It has upwards of 750,000 speakers and is spoken in France and Spain, or the Basque country. I don't want to get political there, please don't hang me. It is what's called a language isolate. People have tried to trace Basque to being related possibly to the Finno-Ugric languages. There are some similarities, very distant in some way, but it may just be a coincidence because there's no firm evidence of any solid connection between these languages. They arose in Siberia, and the Basques are from where they are presently along the Pyrenees in the far west of Europe, probably the last native Europeans. Icelandic, on the other hand, is certainly firmly within the Indo-European branch, like Welsh and French and Romanian and Polish, but it's from the Germanic branch. It arose in the North Atlantic as the Vikings expanded across the Atlantic Ocean. The Icelandic language is the closest living language to what was Norse, the language of the Viking peoples. It's kept a complex case system. It uses a lot of what's considered older vocabulary. Icelandic, even though it has its own state and a large island, is spoken by much fewer people than Basque. In fact, twice as many people and more speak Basque than in Iceland, just over 300,000 people. But it has a rich heritage and literature, which maybe I'll make a video on that in the future. It's certainly worth it. Going back to these two languages, they have no relation to each other. There's There's not even any common languages that they're touching or near each other, so they had to create a form of communication that was entirely unique to their situation in order to even have basic ideas exchanged between each other. So how did the Basques get up there in the first place? It's not exactly the most logical place that you would choose to go to first. And it's not the first place they chose to go to. So the Basques became a whaling people. They began the commerce of blubber, the whale blubber, giving it to churches, and this began around the year of 670 AD. We have documents from that. Now, it progressed on a very slow scale. Probably when the Normans were coming in, there was a need to adapt in some way, and the Basques really began to have a successful whaling enterprise so that they could compete with these people from the north. And certainly by the 12th century, the Basques were progressing outward into the ocean along the Bay of Biscay, hunting whales. We have increasing legal documents, exchanges of who owes who money in terms of the church and the neighboring kingdoms. And this progresses into the 13th century on an increasing scale, and you get local Basque regions with their own coat of arms. Having a coat of arms with a whale on it was a big deal. It meant that you had right and consent from the king to hunt whales and raise profits from it. This was a lucrative business, not just for meat. This was not simple game here. The whales had oil, and in the medieval times, the commodity of light was one of the most valuable things. There were no light bulbs. This was to give illumination to whole towns. Having a single whale's blubber could provide light for many nights. So having this on your town's coat of arms was a symbol of prestige and rank, and that you competed for social standing in the world. So you get places like this. These coats of arms are not some simple saying that we like how whales look. This is an economic statement to the world of their ambition. So you can see from these coats of arms for these towns and regions that the whaling enterprise was increasingly important, not only for commerce for the Basque people, but for their very identity. And by the 15th century, certainly, the Basques were going to the New World off the coast of Labrador and Newfoundland. Some people said that they had been there in the year 1392, but that could be speculation. We don't have any solid evidence. However, what we do know is that certainly going into the 15th century, they had stations for hunting whales all around the coast of Newfoundland, and this was a lucrative enterprise. But as it ran out in the Bay of Biscay, the right whale was the one they were hunting. It also began to go more scarce off the coast of Newfoundland, and they went to Iceland, especially in the 17th century. And this is really where this pidgin emerges in the 17th century as the Basques begin to come ashore in terms of commercial interests with the Icelandic people. It wasn't always peaceful. In 1615, the Basques had a shipwreck. 80 of their crew survived, but they went up ashore, and there was an instance of raiding some for fish because, well, they appear to have been starving. And the local sheriff, Ari Magnusson, said that we should kill these people and declare them outlaws. 32 of the Basques were murdered in what became the killing of the Spaniards, or in Icelandic, Spanjarvangvingen. I don't know if I said that right, but there you go. So obviously when two groups cannot communicate, bad things happen. But over the course of this century, in the 1600s, it appears that this pidgin language arose, and we get our first glimpses in manuscripts toward the end of this century. The first manuscript which we have is the Vocabula Gallicum. Gallicum comes from the word for Gaul or France. So these Basques, in this case, probably came from the present-day French administrated side of the Basque country. And this is our largest text for these words. We have sentences as well as short words written in lists to explain what they are in Icelandic. We have 517 of these sentences and words, as well as over 40 numerals probably to help people communicate in terms of trading money. The next one we have is Vocabula Biscaya, which is the Biscay vocabulary or Biscayan words for the Basque language. In this one we have 229 words and short sentences. We have a couple other manuscripts as well, but these are from copies of other manuscripts which have been lost. So we don't have much to go on with this Basque Pidgin language. But here's a bit of what it looked like. Basque had a subject, verb, object word order. Subject, verb, object is more in what you see in most of the Indo-European languages. Not the traditional Basque word order, but the word order of languages like Dutch and French. So this reflects that these Basque speakers were absorbing structural syntax of other languages in an attempt to create some kind of simple pidgin to communicate with them. There's also an extreme example here in that the Basques and those that surround them conjugate their verbs, and this pidgin does not conjugate verbs at all. It's simply word, 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 insert. It is a simple language. Let me give you some example here, but first the vocabulary. Where does it come from? So the vocabulary comes from 3 language groups. Basque, mainly, and the vast majority, like ser is the word for what. You get Travala, which is French, but it kind of entered the Basque language and became a Basque word. Gisuna is the word for a man. But what I really want to get to here is the words that come from the Latin and Germanic branches. The word mala comes from mal and it means bad or evil. This could come from French, it probably does, but it could come from Spanish as well. You get quite random words in some of these word lists, like kilika is from Basque and it means to tickle. Maybe there was some prostitution going on, I don't know. Bai and es mean no and yes in Basque, and you see both of these in this pidgin, but you also see this word vi or vi, and this comes from oui, French. So French is influencing the very basic words in this language. And you also get pisu, which comes from peso, meaning heavy in that Spanish connotation. A lot of the verbs seem to come from Spanish, like truca from trucar, Spanish for to exchange something, and it comes to mean to buy as well in this pidgin. You get a lot of profanity, oddly enough, which has been copied in some of the later manuscripts. You get gianzu kaka, which means eat shit. Not a very nice thing to say. So let's move on to the Germanic influence on this language. You get for me and for you spelled in this unique way here with the J. This is not from English here, we don't think actually, but from Low German rather than English, which suggests that they were included in quite distant voyages up the coast of Norway perhaps, into Svalbard, beyond that. One that I found interesting was kavinit, which probably comes from Dutch. And you find that a lot of Dutch mercantile fleets were operating around the island of Iceland at the time, and in many cases the Basques were employed by the Dutch to teach them how to whale, and then once they had learned they ditched them, but that's another story. So let's go through a couple sentences here. Kavini truka for me. I buy nothing at all. And what you see here is 3 different languages combining, potentially. Kavinit, nothing at all. Truca, from trucar, Spanish, to exchange. And for me, meaning I. And using for me in this way, like I, it's really reflecting how the Basque language works and trying to express it in an Indo-European way, which is quite amusing. Then to say what do you do in terms of work, ser travala for you. So ser literally is what in Basque. Travala is that word coming from travailler in French via Basque, and for you from German. What do you do? And again, there's putting things in a unique structure in terms of the preposition for me, for you, connecting to the pronoun, which is quite different from what you would expect in, per se, English or French. And then you also have for you mala gisuna, and this means you are an evil man. A lot of these sentences that we have are quite comical like this, and it suggests that the copiers were taking the mick in a way. But it also means that they couldn't really form a lot of complicated sentences with the few words that they had. This was a very basic pidgin, but it suggests that there was a unique cultural exchange here, which probably only has happened once in history. There are competing views about where this Basque language was spoken and used, and between who it was spoken. We know that it was not a native language, but we don't know exactly if it was actually spoken between Basques and Icelandic people, or was it spoken by Basque people that were on ships owned by, example, in the late 1700s, increasingly Dutch merchant vessels going to Iceland. And this is probably the case, that these Basque people use this to communicate on ships owned by companies, for example, from France and the Netherlands, because the composition of these words come from different languages on the continent, and there's not really any Icelandic found in this language. This pidgin language was created for communicating a lot of the times on the open sea, perhaps, rather than in Iceland itself. But why then were these manuscripts in Iceland and translated into Icelandic to give a glossary? We're not exactly sure. It may have just been because people were genuinely interested in languages, as a lot of the Icelanders during this period of learning in the 17th century in Iceland were. Another case may have been that these people were aware that the Icelandic peoples were more familiar with Germanic languages, and so you get words like for you in this pidgin, so that they were able to express basic terminology to Icelandic people from words that they had picked up from other languages that they were hoping that they could understand. Well, I hope you see that a pidgin now is quite different from a native language, and that the idea of a language itself is much deeper than just communication. The Basque Icelandic Pidgin shows us that languages will arise between whoever meets each other to create new ideas, and new ways of expressing. Humans need ways to communicate with each other. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you leave me a like or a word in the comments, I'll be happy to get back to you with any questions that you have, and hopefully try and answer them for you. And we will see you in the next episode. Kurvala.